Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Elliott, Head of Communities at Dow Jones Risk and Research. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar where we're returning to one of the current hot topics in compliance, which is the US enforcement focus on drug cartels and transnational crime groups. We're going to be joined by two experts. I'm going to be talking to them over the next 30 minutes or so. You'll also have the opportunity to ask some questions, though. You can write those into the Q&A box that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as possible later in the program. So I'm very pleased to welcome our expert speakers now. We are joined by Christian Contado. He's a lawyer with the firm Morgan, Lewis and Brokius. He previously has worked in the US government in 3 different departments, in fact, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security. And we're joined from Mexico by Jose Cortina, who is a Senior Managing Director with FTI Consulting. So a little recap first before we get into the conversation. What we've seen over the last few weeks is a series of measures by the US government that underlines this focus on drug cartels and transnational crime groups. This included putting several of those cartels and groups under terrorism designations, including last week one in Venezuela. That was the latest one. We've seen a pivot of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that's the primary US anti-bribery law, a pivot towards focusing the efforts in enforcing that law on those same criminal groups. We saw a lowering of the threshold for transaction reporting along the Mexican border. And most recently, and a move that really has drawn a lot of attention and caused a lot of consternation, I think, in the financial community, we saw the US using new authorities to put heavy restrictions on 3 Mexican financial institutions. So let's dive in now to the conversation. Jose, I'd like to start with you if I could. What are the risks here for specifically for financial institutions, first of all, in this cascading package of measures from the US?
It's an honor to be here with all of you today. Many thanks for the invitation. And Nick, addressing your specific question, the risks are higher than ever. The traditional compliance programs are not going to cut it anymore. You need to demonstrate that you are doing what it is a reasonable effort. That we can later get into what's going to be considered a reasonable effort. But the exposures, and Christian will help me develop what's the legal framework here. But criminal and civil liabilities are the exposure that the financial institutions are having here in Mexico because of the designation of the cartels as terrorism organizations. This elevated the risk exposure, and you need to no longer consider only the KYC procedures, but from your clients, but you also need to consider what's the network of your clients. So they are not involved in cartel activities, one of the members of their network. And that's the risk here. It's not just your clients, it's your clients' clients, vendors, and network that you really need to consider now. So that opens the door for non-traditional ways of mitigating this risk, such as developing different frameworks.
Okay, and we'll definitely come back to those frameworks and other measures that companies can take. But Christian, let's go to you now. Jose mentioned these criminal and civil liability risks. How would you characterize the risk here, given this US focus on these groups?
I think it's, as Jose said, it's significantly higher than it was, say, 8-10 months ago. There's a focus of the U.S. government on the cartels and fentanyl, and they're using a number of different tools and legal regimes to enforce it. Those priorities. The challenge for companies now is they've got multiple different legal authorities that they need to ensure that their compliance program addresses. you know, knowing their third parties, who are their third parties working for, who owns their third parties, and that's customers, vendors, anyone they're indirectly doing business on behalf of. The risks of counterterrorism prosecutions are now present in ways they weren't before. Sanctions and this new FINCEN authority to prohibit transmittals between U.S. institutions has changed the landscape significantly.
To note that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has talked about using a whole of government approach against the drug cartels. Is that what you're describing there, with these different agencies using a variety of different tools to put the squeeze on the cartels?
Yeah, exactly. And I was reminded that the last time I really heard the whole of government approach or all the tools in the toolbox was in the context of the war on terror. And this is looking very similar in that the U.S. government's mobilizing a lot of resources and shifting policy priorities to focus on fentanyl and on the cartels, and particularly right now, Mexico.
So, Jose, given this raft of measures that we've seen over the last few weeks and the increase in risk that you just described, what's been the reaction both within Mexico in financial institutions there, but also what are you hearing from other institutions that are outside of Mexico?
Sure, Nick. So what we are hearing and what we are seeing is that since you could be violating multiple statutes from different regulations and enforced by different authorities, then the options of getting detected or the detection options increase dramatically. So you really need to start monitoring and taking care of what's your business. So let's say before these days, the traditional monitoring process was maybe to refresh your KYC or your client master vendor every 2 years. Now you have to have live 365, 24 hours, 365 days, 24 hours of the day. So you need to make sure you have the right tools to start helping you to trigger some of the risks or the red flags that you need to consider, and you need to demonstrate that you are completely on top of this. Also, we've seen that this problem was just compliance and maybe legal before. Now we're seeing a holistic approach from the company. So now the procurement teams and the finance teams are also involved in understanding what's the level for the organization, for the whole company, and how they can provide or support this effort to protect themselves. So that's what we are seeing pretty much.
And it sounds like what you're describing here, Jose, is where companies should be aiming for in terms of best practice in managing this risk. But is there a gap here? Do you think there's a lot of catch-up work that financial institutions need to do to address the risks that we've just been discussing?
For sure, particularly since there is no list that you can check right now, at least as far as I know, is there is no Cartel of Sinaloa Inc. or like SC that you can understand how the corporate structure is working. So you need to develop also field work or on the ground intelligence to understand who are you dealing with and in which regions you are at the highest risk and what other measures you need to consider for particular regions, industries, and type of clients.
Christian, so you mentioned that FINCEN used new authorities, a section of a law called 2313A. What's the significance of that? What do you think the audience should know about this law and the way that this provision can be used?
I think primarily it's a new tool that can significantly restrict U.S. financial institutions' activities with non-U.S. financial institutions that FINCEN identifies. it's relatively, I mean, it is new. It was enacted last year, and this was the first time it's been used. I think we may see FinCEN use it more frequently, and particularly in this context, because it's the threshold for issuing the orders is tied to fentanyl and the drug trade. So I expect it'll be expanded. It in some ways seems sort of like a sanctions light. It doesn't restrict all activity with the targeted financial institutions, but it can prohibit transmittals, which is a pretty significant portion of business, and then has rippling effects across the industry in Mexico in this case, but in any country where they start implementing more of these orders.
And is there anything to say about the specific institutions that were targeted here? Because they were sizable, but they weren't the largest Mexican banks. Do you think is there a sort of a demonstration going on here, a flexing of the muscles by FinCEN to show, okay, we've got these powers. Companies need to be very cognizant of the risks here, but we're also treading a little carefully because we don't want to disrupt to the whole financial system. What do you think?
Jose, I'm curious to hear Jose's thoughts on this, because he probably has much more direct experience with this. But from our perspective, and reading what's in the orders, it seemed like FinCEN was trying to minimize disruption to the Mexican financial system by picking banks that, highlighted in the orders that these financial institutions were, only such a percentage of the larger Mexican financial system. And there's an implication that maybe it wouldn't be as disruptive. They also could have designated them as SDNs under the OFAC sanctions authorities, and they chose not to for whatever reason, possibly because that would also be much more disruptive on the economic system in Mexico. And it seems like maybe they miscalculated, and that the actions had a much more disruptive effect than they anticipated. And that combined with the Mexican government's action may be why they're pushing out the effective date of these orders to see if they can further minimize any collateral damage, for lack of a better word.
What do you think, Jose?
I mean, it's pretty interesting. Precisely the point you're making, Christian, not using the OFAC SDN or State Department designation, and use the FinCEN, like blanket ban that they have now under the 2313. So it is interesting to see that. So what we are seeing is a lot of fear of the ripple effects across the subsectors and the specific categories of the financial institutions. Nick, as you will pointed out, the total assets that these three financial institutions have under control were around 22 billions. But the problem there that I think was not understood or sized was all the trusts that were under control of these financial institutions. The public works that were handled and such trust within these financial institutions, and how moving those trusts into different financial institutions could complicate even public works from the federal government of Mexico. And so those are the effects that we are seeing, and no matter how small, and it is not small, like 22 billions, it's probably one of the biggest enforcements in FinCEN, right? But to the size of Mexico, one of these effects could impact so many other different sectors and subcategories. The ripple effect is a concern from all the financial institutions, and I'm sure that everybody is doing their homework right now, trying to enhance and do a better job on demonstrating how seriously the financial institutions are taking this regulations and laws.
So let's go back to the steps that organizations need to take And you mentioned, Jose, that it's no longer enough just to do KYC work. You need to understand the whole network of contacts that you have, because there may be risk there. So how do you approach that, though? I mean, that seems like potentially, your network could be like boiling the ocean. It could be a huge task. Is there some kind of risk measure that companies should consider applying here to know where to focus their efforts?
Sure. So what we are seeing, or what we are suggesting, is that a systematic effort to identify and address the formal risks and the stakeholder expectations, it's a critical tool. And we would suggest to do this under direction of counsel because of all the protection that you may have. But the first step is to do a risk and stakeholder impact assessment. And you need to review how you are exposed to specific risk factors. And also you need to understand all the scenarios that are driving all your risks. Then you need to develop your tailored mitigation process and address the specific sectors, the specific threats, what are you most vulnerable, and what are the key red flags that could detonate and enhance different processes. Of course, you need to train your people, and you need to address immediate emerging risks. And lastly, in order for you to do this, you need to develop a crisis management framework. So how are you going to respond, and how you're going to have the availability of the information you need to consider to make the informed decisions and act as fast as possible. The worst you can do is do nothing.
Christian, do you have a view on how the US government would view efforts by companies of the kind that Jose described? Because no compliance program is perfect.
Right.
And still there could be transactions that slip through, dealings with people who it turns out were connected with the drug cartels. But is there any likelihood of some consideration being given here to the steps that a company has tried to make, even if their program proved to be less than perfect?
Absolutely. And what we've been advising clients similar to Jose is to reassess your existing compliance program. And for non-financial institutions, they may not even have a compliance program, or they may have something pretty rudimentary. And we're recommending everybody go back and reassess, look for vulnerabilities and gaps to try and fill those and mitigate any risk of violations. Everybody's got a different risk profile, so it's going to be unique to each company as to what they need to do. But by implementing something that's reasonable, and that can get kind of fuzzy. So, as Jose's saying, you've got to, do some enhanced due diligence that makes sense for your business and try to put these controls in place to minimize the risk of a violation. But, as you noted, as a practical matter, no system is going to be foolproof, and it's possible that there will be inadvertent violations. One of the things that the government has always considered as a mitigating factor is, do you have a compliance program in place? Was it reasonable for your risk profile? And did you implement it? Having a paper compliance program that you either can't or do not follow is not going to help you very much, and could actually hurt you. So it's important to have a reasonable plan that you can follow and to implement it. It's training your appropriate employees. In this case, you might need to expand the number of employees that get this training because the risks are broader. Another interesting thing that's happened is, along with this U.S. government priority on the cartels and focusing enforcement in these areas, they've also issued updates on corporate compliance. And one of those is to really encourage companies to make voluntary disclosures when they identify potential violations. And that's another mitigating factor that can go a long way towards reducing penalties in the event of an inadvertent violation.
Interesting. And to pick up on something you said there, Christian, you touched on non-financial companies. A lot of our discussion up to this point has been related to the actions against the banks and other moves that's more specifically focused on finance and following the money, but how would you characterize the risks for other types of businesses that have some dealings in Mexico?
I think the risk is similarly high, particularly the FINCEN orders may not have a direct impact on your business. Those are really regulating the financial institutions, but OFAC sanctions, FCPA, anti-terrorism laws, the material support to terrorism is now on the table because these cartels have been designated as terrorist organizations. So these kinds of legal authorities are company agnostic and industry agnostic, and anybody doing business that violates those laws is at risk. And so it's really incumbent on companies to figure out if they're exposed here and how to fill that vulnerability with some sort of mitigation controls.
Jose, the actions against the Mexican financial institutions specifically mentioned precursor chemicals. These are chemicals used to produce fentanyl coming in from China. So I'm guessing here that companies also need to be paying attention to operations of Chinese organizations or indeed international organizations with potential links to cartels and criminal groups. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Nick. And it's curious to see only China while we have a lot of countries that could be used to manufacture this chemical precursors. And also we need to consider other countries that could be potentially involved in the supply chain of getting such precursors into Mexico for the cartels to manufacture the drugs that they sell everywhere. But also I want to touch base a little bit on what was mentioned on the previous response by Christian and your question, Nick, about the non-financial institutions. Because as you know, the DOJ, the OFAC, and the State Department are also involved in this, and not only FINCEN or the financial institution authorities. And you need to consider that within the risks of doing business in Mexico, there are activities such as the extortion payments or the rights of way payments that the companies have to pay. That could be perceived also as aiding and abetting or providing material support to the cartels. And this will have to touch on this question you just asked me about what are the implications of other jurisdictions, other countries involved in the cartel activities. So if your business is transportation, so if your business is supply chain, if your business is, I don't know, like professional services, you need to really be aware of who you are dealing with and who you are doing business with, so that you do not expose yourself or your company to potential links to the cartels, hence the problems that you may face with the whole government approach that we just discussed.
I think that's an important point too, is particularly with material support to terrorism, there's not a lack of willingness or coercion defense. And so if you're making protection payments or ransom payments to a designated party or to an organization that's been designated as a terrorist organization, those are potentially prosecutable offenses. You know, the government has some discretion, so they'll look at the whole of the matter, but that risk is there, and there's not an exception for these sort of non-willing transactions. And I wanted to go back as well to the precursor chemicals coming from China. That's certainly the focus of these recent orders, but you know, these chemicals can be routed all sorts of places, and so could be coming in from other countries. And the orders mentioned, you know, Germany, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and India as parts of the supply chain. So it seems to be clear that the U.S. government's focus is on Chinese suppliers, but for companies trying to mitigate the risk, it could come from anywhere.
Do you think, is there a perception difference here among non-US companies? Say if you're a European or Asian company that has some business in Mexico, are you perhaps less attuned to the risks because it just seems further away? And is there also a risk here that if the US government decides to pick another company, to prosecute a company over these kinds of actions, that they're more likely to pick a foreign company? I don't know if, Christian, do you have a view on that?
I do. I think this administration has seemed in other contexts to focus on bad activities, to prioritize bad activities by non-US companies. So I think there's a risk there, but there's always been, in the sanctions context, the risk that if the US government determines, say, European or any other non-US company is providing support to a designated party, that entity or individual risks themselves being added to a sanctioned party list. And that's always a tool that the US government will use if it feels that someone outside the US jurisdiction is providing support that would be in violation if it was done by a US person. And that's a big risk. You are cut off from the US financial system, and then other countries often end up following suit, and so it can really be damaging to a company. So to the extent they're not, I think non-US companies really should start paying close attention to this as well.
Just like it happened when the FCPA started really enforcing, right, Christian? They started with the non-US companies, and it looks like it is like a head start for the US companies to clean the house and gear up for what's coming, and it's also consistent to what we saw with Lafarge and Chiquita Banana as well, non-US, the first enforcement of the FTOs.
I have those cases in my notes too.
For the audience, just a reminder that you can ask questions. We'll get to those shortly. We've got several that you've written in already, but there's space for more. You can put those in the Q&A box you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. Jose, you talked about the measures that companies should consider taking, the additional due diligence, the looking more broadly across your network. But are there also patterns of behavior that would indicate a possible involvement by somebody with a drug cartel? Anything that should serve as a red flag?
So you need to understand, Nick, how the numbers are looking like in your financial and operational controls. So let's say you have a company that has minimum to no presence and minimum to no activity, and all of a sudden you are engaged in business with millions of dollars with this client, vendor, or whatever. So that's one of the risks you need to also be monitoring, not just the onboarding. Also, you need to consider some other, like schemes that we've seen lately where the cartels are using perfectly legit companies to get into or to pass the onboarding process of a company. And all of a sudden, the shareholding structure changes and the owners show up, and those owners could potentially be linked to the cartels. So you need to be on top of those things. Suddenly, like very broad services that one company can do, like one company cannot do everything, right? So you need to be sure that you're engaging with a specific and expert services providers or vendors. Another recommendation that we have been issuing is simplify your process, right? So if you're going to engage with a company, and it's really hard to understand who is the ultimate beneficiary owner, and it takes, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 layers to get into the last 2%, the last mile of the corporate structure, or 5%. Then you need to make a smart decision and assess if you want to work with a company with a very complex structure, shareholding structure. So all those red flags could help you make the smart and fast decisions so you can be agile and mind your business and take care of your business. Otherwise, you're going to become FTI or Dow Jones, right? Like, you need to be concentrated and focus on your business.
That's a good segue to the first question I'm going to take. This comes from Catherine. I think, given that you just gave the answer you gave, Jose, I'll put this one to you first of all. Catherine's asking, for non-financial institutions, how deep into their supply chain or customer lists should they go? Is there one answer to that, or does it really depend on the type of business that they're in and hence the risk they face?
Yeah, I would suggest to use like a risk matrix specific to your business and specific to the industry of your client, and based on that, decide which different boxes of your risk matrix the specific situation is touching, so you can decide how deep you need to go, or simply just pass on that client. But I don't know, Christian, what do you think?
I think that's right. I think I'd also add the government enforcement authorities will expect companies to use all the information that they have. So if you're collecting information about a counterparty that's outside of your diligence process, and you don't use that information in your diligence process and there's a violation, that could be an aggravating factor. So making sure that whatever you're collecting about your counterparties is incorporated into the diligence process and used to evaluate the risk.
Yeah, and additional to that, like what we're doing is we're putting together a risk map, and depending on the state, the municipality, and the type of business that the clients are having, and the type of known activities from the cartels, that's when you also decide if you enhance the due diligence process that you need to conduct for a specific transaction or client or vendor.
Follow-up question to that then, Jose. How would a company go about understanding the extent of cartel activity in a specific area? Is that publicly available information, or does it require hiring an analysis firm?
I would suggest hiring an analysis firm, and trust me, this is not self-serving, but an analysis firm could have the different experts' opinions and different knowledge that it is not publicly available, or that it would be really hard to digest or to resume and in order to be applicable to your specific situation. So having someone, an expert that understands the risks and understands different type of industries and businesses would be very helpful for you to decide what's the action plan, what are you going to design specifically for your company and for different specific situations that may arise.
So next question comes from Paulina. Christian, I'll start with you on this one. Paulina wants to know, what are your suggestions to enhance a compliance program and make it stronger in countries where the government is potentially involved with cartels? And more specifically, how do you mitigate the risk with import-export operations where the authorities and customs brokers may be connected to the cartel? Great question. I'm not sure that there's an easy answer, though, is there?
No, I think it's that raises your risk significantly. Particularly, I would recommend reviewing your anti-corruption policies and procedures. Anytime you're dealing with government officials, and particularly if they might be tied to the cartels, there's a U.S. government priority to go after, to use the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, against the cartels and officials, government officials who may be working on their behalf. So, looking at those kinds of issues, where's your money going? What's it being used for? And accounting for that is much more important in that kind of situation. Relying on, customs brokers and things like that also increases the corruption risk. And again, if you're making payments to government officials or you're meeting with government officials, we recommend that companies document that and that they have justification for the funds they disperse to, ensure that they're legitimate.
Jose, anything you would say about that question?
Yeah, for sure. And of course, when you are meeting with government officials, just make sure that the people that are meeting with them are properly trained on how to address potential corruption issues, and also try to automate as much as possible in your processes, particularly also with custom brokers. There are specific fees. I don't know what's the English word for that, but it's called aranceles, which is like an official rate that it is public. And you can use your financial controls to make sure that you are paying whatever you are supposed to be paying. Also make sure that your custom brokers are well known and that you can make sure, or not make sure, at least to have proof that the custom brokers also has a strong compliance program. So those are decisions that you can make in order to demonstrate your reasonable efforts to demonstrate that your whole network is in compliance with this, and particularly addressing these FTO specific risks, not just the traditional FCPA AML ones, this specific FTO risks as well.
Next question comes from Artur, who wants to know what actions financial institutions should take in the areas of policies, procedures, monitoring tools, and training. We've covered some of that. Jose, anything else that you think we haven't covered that Artur would benefit from hearing?
Yeah, sure. I think we should discuss the cryptocurrency land right now. This is relevant based on what Artur was saying. The different sources of money and how the sophisticated schemes of the cartel are evolving. It's something that we really need to be aware of. So you would see, for example, the reduction of the threshold of the $10,000 that the money business services companies have to reduce to $200 to inform and to put together a file of the client. Those are the type of things that the financial institutions need to consider, and the monitoring tools. If you take a look at what would be the effort to put together a file and to monitor every $200 or higher transaction in the border between Mexico, California, and Texas, it is impossible to be done without the right tools. So you can adapt or incorporate specific tools with AI that can help you trigger and put together the file or blockade the transactions that are not being properly supported, or that you don't have enough information from the client to upload into your system. So those are the type of things that you need to consider and implement if you want to be on top of everything. And if you don't do it and you don't demonstrate the reasonable effort you did to implement this technology that will be critical for you, then you could be in trouble.
And I suppose the other point might be that this is not one and done, is it? Because the cartels will continue trying to find ways to launder the money associated with drugs and to transact in the drugs. So do financial institutions need to stay very vigilant about the methods being used by the cartels and crime groups?
I think it's part of the risk assessments that they have to be ongoing. This is here to stay. Like you need to have workshops or whatever you have to do with your security and the security and safety experts within your asset protection or whatever the team within your company is in charge of that, and understand what are the risks and how are they evolving, so you can be on top of it as well.
Christian, I'll put this next question to you because it's specifically about the 2313A clause. It comes from Wei, who wants to know about how the description of the transmittal of funds should be interpreted. Is this something you've looked at at all? She's looking for a specific answer about how it applies to wire transfers and virtual currency.
I'm sorry, that I must have lost the connection for a second. Could you repeat?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So this is under the 2313A authority under the Fentanyl Act. So Wei is asking how that should be interpreted, and specifically in relation to, is there anything to say about it in relation to wire transfers and virtual currencies? Is that something you've looked at all?
It does apply to virtual currencies as well. I think FINCEN was expressed about that. and wires would be covered. It's the transmission of funds from a U.S. financial institution or from a Mexican bank to a U.S. financial institution. And so it would cover the transmission to any covered financial institution. The interesting thing with virtual currency too is we're in a climate right now where the United States is pursuing a lot of deregulation, and the virtual currency industry is growing, and so the compliance risks there are also increasing then. And if someone is dealing in virtual currency transactions, then being able to track those and ensure that to the best that they can that they're compliant with sanctions and the FINCEN regulations is increasing important too.
I'm going to roll two questions together here because they're on a similar topic. Jose, I'll start with you. These come from Sergio and from Ricardo. Sergio asking about whether Mexican banks could be designated under FINCEN 311, and Ricardo asking, is it likely that other financial institutions in Mexico could be targeted by FINCEN? What do you think? Is there a pattern here potentially?
I mean, take it with a grain of salt. I'm not the authority here, but I would say yes. Like any other financial institution, not just banks, could be next in the list. We don't know right now what would be the trigger, but of course, this is a real risk that it's here to stay. So as long as you have your enhanced programs addressing FTOs specifically, and you have a story that to tell that can be backed up, then you should have no concerns. This is not just for Mexican financial institutions. This is country agnostic. It could be any other country just involved in any of these schemes. And to elaborate a little bit more on the very nice question that Christian provided, it doesn't matter how it is. You just need to transmit funds. It doesn't matter if it's cash, if it's crypto, if it's wire, if it's check. It doesn't matter. It's just the transmittal of funds. The problem that the U.S. authority is trying to work on or to control better.
I'd add to that.
Yeah.
From a legal perspective, to go back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, we're seeing a whole of government approach here, using all the tools in the toolbox. These are the phrases that they like to use. But what that means is they're going to use what they need to use. They've already shown us that FINCEN is going to take action, so they could take action under any of their other authorities. OFAC can take action. They can bring FCPA or counterterrorism prosecutions. I think what companies should expect is that anything the U.S. government has, if they determine it's the right tool, they're going to use it.
Yeah, and there are other type of financial institutions that are at high risk. Like for the Mexicans in this webinar, you would be familiar with the SOFOMs and the SOFIPOs, and this also financial institutions, non-regulated, that are also moving money, the brokers. Other type of companies and industries, like we said, logistics, pharmaceutical, like all those high risk industries right now because of the FTO's designations and the Fentanyl Act, that could also be impacted as well. And if you have those type of clients within your network, well, you better make sure that the clients are strong in compliance and that they are addressing this FTO's risk specifically.
Yeah, and the other thing that this reminds me of is when the U.S. government issues guidance for industry and things like that, it's a warning shot. They're saying we are focusing on this. When we saw, in addition to pharmaceutical risk, there's risk in the oil industry now with sales of oil that are linked to the cartels. And so keeping an eye out for what the government is saying in terms of guidance and recommendations is also a good way to look for risk areas as they develop.
And sadly, we're out of time. Apologies to those of you who asked questions we didn't get to, but rest assured we'll be returning to this topic, both in events such as this, but also via Risk Journal, which is our news and analysis platform where we've been covering this whole area quite closely with our dedicated team of journalists. Jose and Christian, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and expertise. You provided a lot of value to the audience. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We hope that you can come again to another one of these webinars, which we hold frequently, and we'll be keeping close track of what goes on in this area and providing you with the latest information when we can.